Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy. So Mike, when did you first become interested in aviation?
Well, growing up with a pilot as a father, of course, he had us. He didn't force us to like it, but it's just obvious, just natural that we would, be very interested in aviation. As far back as I can remember, my dad was also an avid aircraft modeler, and he did quite well. He used to win contests because he'd do above and beyond. Instead of a standard model, he would change it to where it's not the standard model you buy in a store, but it's better. He made the type of aircraft he flew had two, a single seat version 105 F-105 Thunder Chief and a two seat. Well, before they even had the G model in a 1/32 scale, he would buy two single models and cut, and he put this together, and it was awesome. And he won a contest with that. And so we always loved aircraft, either just watching them at air shows or models. My brother and I both did U control. I don't know if you remember those. That's when you're in the center and you.
Oh, yes, yeah.
we both did that in our teen years, like early, like 12 and 13 and 14. And that's when we got heavily into the World War II era because, they had the props.
Yes.
They didn't have that you could around. So but we always loved war movies with aviation themes, like the Blue Max. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's a World War I classic with there's a lot of great aircraft, and early World War I aircraft in that one. World War II, we loved 633 Squadron. It was a Mosquito. We love British airplanes. I think I love British airplanes more than U.S. airplanes because of Spitfires, Mosquitoes, Lancasters. I don't know. They just have that extra kind of coolness to them. And then, of course, by the time my dad was flying, of course, he was in the jet age, and we loved the F-105, just massive aircraft that you could stand under the wing. I don't think I could barely probably touch the bottom of the wing. It is such a large aircraft. When it's standing there, you could stand full on. We're not super tall people, about 5'7", but I mean, just could not reach the bottom of the aircraft. It's just huge. So we always interested in the aircraft, and so it kind of just made sense that we'd want to do something with the military once we grew up.
Yeah, and I've had the pleasure of talking to your dad, an absolute legend, and your brother. But I think the story your dad told me of why you joined the Navy is because he got rescued. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, it's all true. I mean, we obviously didn't get drafted into the Navy because of his rescue, but we did feel a little bit of an obligation, just because the Navy really did go above and beyond to pick him up, because they could have. It was overland, which that doesn't mean they don't do pickups, but it was a complicated rescue where gas was a serious issue, and you might have already seen or heard the story, but they could have a number of times just said, we tried, we can't get there, but they really risked their own necks and they picked them up. So it kind of speaks for the ethos in the Navy is and that's what I've always loved about the Navy. It's completely different sort of mindset from your garrison mode branches like the Army or the Air Force, where there's always a commander that they can go to get permission. Yes. But when you're out at sea, the CO, the skipper of the boat or squadron is the final authority, and he has to make the call because there's nobody. He's entrusted to make the call out, thousands of miles. And when you think about the history of the Navy, again, off the British Navy, the U.S. Navy is based off the British Navy, and a lot of our traditions come from that. But even into my time as a squadron commander, we still had, this is kind of an interesting segue, but when we're talking about disciplinary actions or punishments, a lot of people found it very strange that even in this modern day, I, as a squadron commander or a commander in the Navy, could, as discipline, hand out only bread and water for a sailor who has misbehaved. You can put him in the brig, which is a jail cell. Even on the aircraft carrier, we have these tiny little jail cells
Wow, didn't
for
know
for
that.
misbehaviors, and give them bread and water for only 3 days. That's 3 days maximum. They have only recently, and I think in the last maybe 10 years, have changed that where you can no longer do that. But when I joined in 1984, that was a punishment you could hand out, which sounds very draconian,
It
but
does.
it was actually intended if you wanted to get keep a sailor, because it was kind of a way to really wake him up and say, hey, stay, fly straight if you want to be in this man's Navy. And a lot of times it saved them. And quite honestly, it was quicker. If they did 3 days bread and water, it was probably better than 30 days restriction or 30 days extra duty. You couldn't hand out a whole bunch of them. That was kind of like, this is the sailor I want to really, I want to make an impression on this guy. So because of that, the Navy always had sort of a different approach in my mind of how to command, especially at sea, which again, you're only authorized to do that bread and water when you are out at sea. You couldn't do it back on land, because then we are more like an Air Force or an Army type of mindset. But that's what makes it interesting about the sea. There's just nothing like being thousands and thousands of miles away from your home port with absolutely no real, the carrier is your home and your base, and it's thousands of miles from anywhere, and it makes sort of an interesting mindset, just because I've flown when we've intercepted Soviet bombers back in the 80s. That was kind of the primary mission of the F-14, was the interceptor, and it was sort of a game from the Cold War where the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, would attempt to try to locate the aircraft carrier and the battle group as soon as they could. They obviously knew when we were pulling out of, say, San Diego, because I was a West Coast sailor for most of my life. They knew approximately when we were going to leave, and they had that sort of intel. But once we get out in the big open sea, it became sort of a game where they would do their best to locate the carrier.
Yeah.
And we would feel like we'd want to get as far west or as close to that theater, either towards the Korean theater or Hong Kong or wherever, China, before they could find us. So we would do interesting things like lights out, which is not a huge deal, because but out at sea in the dark, you could see the carrier lights from 25, 30 miles away. So lights out, but the more important one was the electronic emissions. So like, you can't talk on the radio, because obviously they could maybe find you with that. You can't turn your radio, can't turn your radar on. So you can imagine when you're flying around and really all you've got is TACAN emissions to point you where to go home, or a radar that you might be able, because the Tomcat had an air-to-air radar, but you could use it. When you point it down, you could see objects on the water. You see water, so you could actually maybe find the aircraft carrier. If you could cheat before, because you didn't have to have your radar off the whole time. But as you got within 50 miles, usually they wanted to ensure that you had your radar off, because as you had that huge bubble around the carrier, if you had a 100-mile diameter around the carrier, that made it a little more difficult for the Soviets to find the ship. So we would, again, try to go as far westbound as we could. And I remember my first deployment in 1987, and the bears had come out. They've discovered us. And, of course, our intel and our radar on the ship would see them hundreds of miles out. So we would get launched, usually from an alert status, where we had various levels of alert. The highest was alert 5, where you're actually sitting in an airplane, strapped in, everything's ready to go. And as soon as you get the indication that you're a launch, 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, you're supposed to be airborne off the catapult and on. Wow. And that's this night. Of course, it's always night, right? So we got up at night, and we're looking. We're told, go find this Soviet bomber that's headed out. Again, their intent is to find the ship, and our intent is to find them and be right next to them, usually flying between them and the ship because they eventually will find the aircraft carrier. So our intent is to be the protection and fly with it as it is. So sure enough, we find the bear, and it's night, and of course we pull up next to it, and boom, these super spotlights just blind, and that's their intent, is to sort of flash blind you, right? And they do all those kinds of things, but you could throw your visor down and you try not to stare into the light, but they do tricky things like that. They would do a really slow descent, so that if you're flying off the, you're looking down and you're only a few hundred feet off the water at night. And you had kind of known, they try all those kinds of things. They had a little bit of a sense of humor on some. I remember when you pull in real close, the tail gunner usually had a Playboy magazine from the U.S.
Yeah.
He would pull it out and he'd show you that they have all of the great things from America, and so that made it interesting. But it also, again, now you got to get back to the ship, and you could be up to now 1,000 miles away from the aircraft carrier, and at night. And of course, the aircraft carrier is not stationary; it's moving, so it's not necessarily where you left it, 3 or 4 hours ago. And that's where it gets a little bit dicey, because you're again 1,000 miles. There's no place to land if you should have any kind of issues, any hydraulic or any kind of mechanical issues, or worse is gas. Of course, they always try to have airborne gas from the aircraft carrier that can come out and meet you, a couple hundred miles away from the ship. Back in my day, they had A6 intruders that were not only bombers but tankers. They carried buddy stores as well, so they tanked you, as well as the S3, which was designed primarily as anti-submarine warfare, but it kind of became the go-to airborne fuel carrier, because it had a lot of gas that it could carry, and it was very efficient with its engine. So they would usually try to meet you, if you needed it. But I remember one night, and back in the 80s, there was 2 Tomcat squadrons in each air wing. About the 90s, when they started reducing our numbers, they made one single Tomcat squadron in each air wing, and it was usually had a little larger number of airplanes than we used to have, like say 8 or 9 aircraft in the each squadron when you had 2 of them, and you'd have what you call your sister squadron, which was always a heavy competition. Who's the better Tomcat squadron? And I remember on my first deployment, they launched, usually had one each squadron had 1 aircraft on for alert. And, the one that gets off first is, the winner. It's again a competition. The one that joins or finds the bomber, the bear first, that's a competition. You want to get your picture, so that when it goes back to the intel and up to the admiral, it's your own squadron aircraft with it, not your sister squadron. It's again a competition. But on this particular night, and it was just dark. And again, and this is probably early on the cruise where we hadn't had any previous experience intercepting the bears. And I rememremember a young guy in the other squadron was running really low on gas, and he was having problems finding, because you have to a certain extent, you have to dead reckon. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar, but that dead reckoning is essentially, I've traveled north for 30 minutes, and then I traveled east for 30 minutes. So you sort of, in your mind or even on a piece of paper, you kind of plot roughly where you went and how far and over time. And then you can kind of figure, well, if I go back at this, this many degrees for this long, I should be close. And again, with the modern electronics of the day back in the 80s was not very dissimilar from what they were in the 60s. I mean, most of my cruises in the 80s, we used the TACAN. And a TACAN is essentially there's a beacon on the ship that transmits a signal that you dial in the frequency, and you have a little on your compass. You have this little arrow that goes boop, and it tells you that's where the carrier is. But when we're doing the MCON, where we're not trying to be seen, they turn that off. And we know they say, hey, we're going to be MCON condition blank, and so we know it's not there. So you have your dead reckoning, that's your most primary method of getting back towards where you were. You also had, again, when you're out at range, you can cheat with your radar. You have your radar on, you can look down, you might see it, and then you can, you drop a waypoint. And a lot of listeners might think, well, what about the inertial navigation system? Tomcat had one. It was not. It was not very good. It was
Was
not
this in
super.
the A model at the time?
It was the A model, and it was essentially the same as in the B and the D model because it was
Okay.
part of the avionics package. That was not one of the things that got changed. Now we did get in the digital version in the what they call the F-14B upgrade and the F-14D. They had digital bus for digital architecture. So we did get GPS, and of course that changes everything. Because that's very accurate. And so, but back in with the A, when really all you had was the inertial navigation system, and quite often that would drift. It was not that reliable. So on this particular night, these folks were having problems in our sister squadron, and I remember hearing the worry in his voice. His pitch was getting higher and higher. And you're not even supposed to be chatting on the radio. Yeah. Especially within a certain number of miles of the ship. And at one point, when the crap hits the fan, where you can no longer, think, hey, this is it. I'm in serious danger. I could run out of gas, or I'm going to crash here if I can't land soon. You have a code word, which it was typically light show. If you scream out light show, that means, hey, I'm in trouble. Turn on the stupid TACAN so that I can see exactly where I need to go. And sure enough, at one point, this guy was screaming, "Light show, light show!" And of course, then we all take advantage because now we could all, find. But we had a pretty good idea. It's interesting because when you're out at sea, big open ocean, if the moon is out at all, you could still see a little bit. You could see the carrier, especially again if it has its lights on. But under those MCON conditions where lights out, no emissions, no radio contact, it got pretty interesting to say the least. Once again, we got the digital architecture in the aircraft to include GPS. It was not nearly as big a deal because the link from the aircraft carrier was getting fed through your system. So it would keep up to date where the aircraft carrier was. So it was not quite as bad, but it made for some really interesting times in the 80s with the older version of the Tomcat, especially when we were intercepting the Soviets. But we intercepted those guys way out there. And again, that was a trick. You never want to see the admiral would be really upset if a Soviet aircraft just went flying over the aircraft carrier with escort from us. So again, it made for some really interesting times.
Absolutely, yeah. But as our viewers will know, you flew. We mentioned just briefly before the A, B, and D. Can you tell us the difference between each model?
Sure. Initially, the Tomcat was designed primarily off of the F-111 that was supposed to be one of these one-size-fits-all Air Force, Navy, and it was not very carrier suitable. But the Air Force did keep the F-111 aardvark for them. And if you ever look at the planes, well, there is some similarity. They both had variable wing sweeps. But the biggest commonality between them was that the Tomcat retained the Hughes AUG-9 radar system. So that was sort of like the basis of the interceptor for the Tomcat because that allowed multiple trackball scan where you could track multiple targets at once and you could actually launch your Phoenix missiles. And I'm sure you've seen that where you could launch, you could carry 6 Phoenix missiles. And I knew the guy who was in the test community who got to shoot all those $1 million. So that was the Tomcat design was primarily from the AUG-9 and the radar suite and the trackball scan and the Phoenix missile because we were the only aircraft that carried that big Phoenix missile, which could reach out and touch your enemy out at 100 miles, which was when you think about that technology back in the 60s, I mean, the late 60s, it's insane. And we used it tactically. We had that. That was a huge advantage for the Tomcat because not only did you get to launch it so far out, but it's a launch and leave weapon because it had its own little radar. The aircraft radar, host radar, would feed information into the Phoenix missile radar, and at a certain point it would go active, and at that point the host aircraft is no longer required. So when it got to a point where we might be in danger of getting hit from an enemy missile, if you can let your missile, your wingman go, taking them out, and you could turn away, and once it's active, you could turn away. Well, that's best of both worlds, because now we're out of their reach, but our missiles out there to get them. So all the Tomcats had that. The unfortunate part about the A was, from what I have always read, was that the engines we ended up with, the Pratt & Whitney F-30s, were not the actual. They were sort of like a holdover from the early part of the program, and they were not supposed to be the end engines. But budget cuts, all of a sudden, boom, that was the engine, and that was the weak link of the F-14A. Well, finally, the NavAir folks and the Navy got some money and said, hey, we're gonna fix this, because we had a lot of compressor stalls, and if you lose the distance between the engines on the Tomcat, if you look at it, is enormous. It's not like the F-15 or F-18 where they're right next to each other, because if you go single engine in the F-15 or F-18, your exhaust or your thrust is still coming from mostly right, just maybe slightly different. In the Tomcat, it was 12 plus feet of difference. If you had one engine out, you had a really exaggerated yaw movement, and that unfortunately cost a few of our aviators lives. If you have that in a bad scenario where you're not very fast, you're gonna the first female Tomcat pilot who unfortunately died, that's what kind of bit. One of her engines went bad, and at that slow speed is very difficult to open that yaw, and you basically depart and crash. So the F-14B was the resolve of getting better engines, and we got the General Electric F-110 engines, and man, not only were they more reliable, but they were much more powerful in terms of their. So the thrust to weight of the Tomcat went up significantly with the F-14B. They also said, well, let's make a couple extra upgrades to it. So they called it the B upgrade for the longest time. Well, I take that back. When the very, very first upgrade came out, we at Miramar called it the F-14A Plus.
A plus, yeah.
That didn't last all that long, because then it just became its own designation, F-14B. And then B upgrade, once it got that digital bus that allowed it to do certain other functions. It had better raw radar early warning gear, but it was essentially the same, and it had a slightly enhanced HUD, but it was still not a classic new,
glass, yeah.
Right. Well, even the 14 had the glass, the actual physical glass, but it was, the information on it was just not great, and it wasn't very dynamic. Most guys would turn down their HUD imagery quite a bit, just so, because it wasn't giving them all that much in the way of, and it actually, you could see through the glass better to land on the aircraft carrier. But the B also had a couple upgrades, but it was basically F-14A with bigger engines. And then they came out with the D, and this is when Miramar was at its heyday. I got there in 1980. I got winged in early 1986, but of course I knew I was going to Tomcats before I got winged. They don't surprise you. I knew I got selected for Tomcats in 1985, and at one point in the late 80s, they were still producing Tomcats, and they said, hey, we're gonna make F-14Ds. And not only are we going to have F-14Ds, we're going to take all these F-14As that we already made, and we're going to send them back and retrofit them to become F-14Ds. And we're thought, this is it, man. And the F-14D had a lot of new stuff in it. If you look inside the cockpit, you could still kind of tell, but it had multi-function displays instead of the old classic steam round gauges that say, the HUD was much, much improved. The HUD looked like, a real HUD. It had all kinds of great information. Made for landing on the aircraft better, made for weapons employment better. It was a true HUD that had all that information up there. Had the big engines. In the backseat, instead of the tactical information display, which was this sort of round fishbowl, they developed what was called the PTID, or programmable tactical information display, which was almost like what they have today. It was a big square screen that had buttons, and the resolution was better, so you could do all kinds of good things. And we ended up needing that, because when the other thing they kept doing was slapping aftermarket upgrades that weren't designed, and they weren't even around when the Tomcat was designed. For instance, NVGs. For quite a while, the Tomcat didn't have night vision goggle capability.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, you don't just wear goggles, but you had to have the lighting system in the cockpit. Otherwise, things would blossom and you can't see. So that wasn't a huge deal, but you had that. Then you had all the upgrades, and the F-14D had a APG-65, which was an improvement. So we went away from the AUG-9, and you had the APG-65, which had medium PRF. And I don't want to get too technical, but there are various types of radar signals that you can send out. There's high PRF, low PRF. The medium PRF, it gives your radar the capability of seeing aircraft move. So like in the old days, especially in a high PRF scenario, which is essentially you're tracking Doppler, which is change in velocity. So if somebody's coming at you, well, it's going to see that velocity. If they're going away from you, they're still, and if you're closing or opening, you're going to still see a difference in velocity. But if somebody is right at you, the only closure you have is your own aircraft speed, which happens to be the same as it would be over the ground. And that's what made it difficult for our aircraft to see enemy aircraft that go into what's called the beam. And that's sort of a tactic. If you want to try to hide yourself, you'll turn sideways and try to hold it exactly 90 degrees off in the beam, and the radar is going to have great difficulty. But with medium PRF, it helps solve that. So it could see, airplanes doing all these things. So that was a huge improvement. It actually could carry more type of weapons. It was started to be looked at to be upgraded with AMRAAM, but if you had seen my brother's excellent Tomcat film, Snort Snodgrass, who's a great Tomcat icon, not only as a pilot but as an activist for the Tomcat. He made the wise call of not taking on the added financial burden of adding AMRAAM to the Phoenix because we already had the Phoenix missile. We had a launch and leave capability with the Phoenix. And granted, they're expensive missiles and heavy. They were 1,000 pounds, and the AMRAAM is smaller. But he's like, it became a choice of, can I focus on the air-to-ground mission or add the AMRAAM? And he said, we're going to make the conscious decision to forego adding the AMRAAM to the F-14, and we'll focus on making sure we have a great FLIR a lantern pod. And because when I went through the Tomcat replacement group squadron, where everybody, when they get their wings, they have to go through to learn to fly the F-14. It took anywhere from 9 months to a year, depending on how many delays there were in the aircraft availability. But everybody had to go through there. And when I went through in '86, man, I mean, these guys, nobody wanted anything to do with air to ground. They were still they had Vietnam in their back of their minds, and like, no, we're air to ground only. Yeah, we're air to air. We want to be aces. We don't want to be guys in prisoner of war, because we're bombing guys and getting shot out of the sky. Well, that sort of changed because there wasn't, we had a few skirmishes off Libya, when we shot down 2 MiGs or 2 Fencers or what have you. I mean, the air-to-air business was not really doing much. And by the time Desert Storm came around in 1991, the Tomcat was there, but it got one kill. A guy that I know in VF1 got a helicopter.
Yes,
and that's the sole extent of Stubros was his name, and that was that was the extent of air-to-air action for the Tomcat in all of Desert Storm. And it had F-15s. You had a guy approaching being ace. They had multiple kills. Certain guys had multiple kills, and then our Hornets. We had 2 Hornets that got 2 MiG-21s. So. The Tomcat, I don't want to say it was sort of to be left behind, but it was sort of aging technology, and I give Snort great credit for realizing, hey, if we want to stay in the game, we need to up our game and be able to do more better. And so he added, they added the lantern was a navigation FLIR pod that you could use as a weapon, laser guided weapons with, and strap that on, and then that combination of that pod with the Tomcat, which could already carry way more weapons because it was just a bigger airplane, it could easily carry the 2,000-pound bombs that the Hornets could carry too, but like our Hornets, they were smaller, so if they didn't drop their 2,000 pounds, they would actually have to jettison them before recovering on carry because of the weight considerations. But the Tomcat was big enough that it could actually bring back any 2,000-pound bomb that it didn't drop. So it was a good match between the efficiency of the Tomcat in the air, because it could loiter for a lot longer, and all that it could carry. So it was a good match. And again, I give Snodgrass a lot of credit for that. Everybody always thinks of him as the air show guy, the hot pilot who does this or that, and he did. He flew a lot of aircraft, and probably the most iconic picture of the Tomcat, that one where he's flying over the. Yes. I mean, everybody's seen that. I mean, a lot of people think that it's computerized, but it was real. But he did so much for the community from the inside to keep it in the business, because by the time I deployed, fast forward almost 2 decades, I mean, in 2001, when I deployed for 9/11, it's September 19th of 2001, I mean, the Tomcat was still the big show in town. We could carry the most. We had the resolution that for battle damage assessment that the older Hornets, this is all before the Super Hornet, but the Hornets had a Nighthawk pod, FLIR pod, and it didn't have near the resolution that the Lantern pod of the Tomcat and the big PTID, all that. So they would go out, not to slam my Hornet buddies, but they would go out and they would say, we got that, we got that target, we hit it, and then we would have our film from our FLIR, and you could see better, and you could say, you didn't get it, you hit short, and and then they would utilize that in their battle. What do we need to go back? That kind of. And we could usually find targets. The harder to find targets, we did a lot of interesting things with that Lantern pod, and combined again with the Tomcat, because it's such a big machine that could carry. We didn't go overboard. In fact, more often than not, we carried the smaller of all the bomb. We carried the 500-pound GBUs, because we found we were getting the effects we wanted. Stopping tanks or taking out smaller buildings or what have you. But the bigger the bomb, the greater the collateral damage. And when you combine, the precision guidance on a FLIR pod, so it's going to hit where you want it to hit, and a small but effective bomb of 500 pounds, that was great. And we could carry more of them because they're smaller and better for gas and all that. So it was interesting to see the growth and the evolution of the Tomcat, because had those who said, again, who kind of ruled the community back in the 80s, who were all like, no, we don't want to do air to ground, we want to just be air to air. How many air to air kills has the Tomcat gotten well, we're not going to talk about Iran, because if you've done any interesting reading, yes. There's some business being done by the Iranians, and it's still a thrill to see the Tomcat flying today, even in Iran. They look, these beautiful aircraft are still flying. It's a shame, and a lot of folks, maybe some of your followers, we should still have the Tomcat. There comes a time when every aircraft does need to retire.
Absolutely,
We flew in 1970. I mean, the early 70s, operationally. It was off the coast of Vietnam when they evacuated the fall of Saigon, when they evacuated the last folks out of Vietnam, and it was on a carrier out there, the Tomcat. And so, you put that up from 1975 to all the way, fast forward to, it retires in 2006. Yeah, that's pretty good time.
That's good innings, I think.
Yes, yeah. So it became a little bit difficult to maintain. It was always kind of a bear because there were so many systems. It became a maintenance, I don't say nightmare, but it was difficult because it would take several maintenance man hours for every flight hour. So it's like if you can factor, when you have a car, when you have a brand new car, well, nothing ever breaks. It's a brand new car. Well, that was the Hornet, right? Because it was a brand new airplane, and it had limited issues. And some of the design is better because, as you get newer technology, it's a better design. Mm-hmm. But towards the end there, the Tomcat was it was a real credit to the maintainers, because they were obviously way behind. But we would have to do a lot of cannibalization, which is where you have to rob a part from an airplane that otherwise would be ready to go, but because it's down in the hangar bay, we're going to take this part because we need it now. Boom. So those issues, the maintenance issues, and the expense of, and the fact that they just weren't making any more of them. So it got to be kind of a hard thing to substantiate, to say, hey, we need to have the Tomcat into 2030 and beyond. It was really a cool, beautiful airplane, but it really was
had its day.
To retire. Yeah.
So, Mike, I want to talk about, it's our favourite subject on the channel, DACT. How did the Tomcat, and each model actually, the A, B, and D, fare against, the F-15, F-16, them types? And did you ever get to fly against the RAF types?
Let me see. I don't believe I ever got to fly against any Brits, but I will tell you a great British story for you. When I became an instructor in the Tomcat, after you do your first operational tour, one kind of hopes to continue to fly the Tomcat because you get better and better,
yes,
and be an instructor, because you're really not going to be any better than when you're actually teaching somebody who's never flown the Tomcat before. And you might say, well, that's sort of the basics, but you are getting more experience. So as an instructor at VF-124, the gunfighters, that's the Miramar replacement squadron, we'd always have exchange pilots. Occasionally, we'd have an American go to Britain, fly Tornadoes. Well, we had Clive Bayliss, who was an RAF pilot who was on the staff there at 124, wow. And so I didn't fly with him because we were both instructors. We'd always fly with students, but he was a great guy. And so we have Brits who have, and you probably knew that, we have Brits who have flown the Tomcat, but I've never flown against Brits. We've flown many exercises, mostly in the Southeast Asian area, Malaysia, F-5s. I did get the opportunity to fly against MiG-21 and MiG-17, and not in a war, but a very controlled environment where we had some aircraft that were. Back in the day, it was all secret, but you could assume that we had aircraft from our enemy that we were exploiting, and it got to the point where we could arrange to have fights and see what it's like. We had aircraft in our own inventory that approximate the performance quite well. Yes. So like the F-5 would typically be the MiG-21 simulator, and the A4 would be the MiG-17, but the A4 was actually much better. A4 was pretty bad little airplane. I mean, it had a great roll rate, very hard to see, but mostly if it was the sophistication of the weaponry that we had in the Tomcat that gave us the advantage. Now, so back to your original question. I would argue that the Tomcat wasn't necessarily designed to be a dog fighter. I mean, it was designed to be an interceptor, and that mission was to get airborne and get as fast as it can. And it was a very, very fast airplane. I was able to, on one mission, we were able to go 2.2 Mach, and we didn't go above 2 very often. But in this case, it was a post-maintenance check flight where you have to run the aircraft through a certain set of conditions to make sure it's good to go. And it was the very first F-14D that incurred any kind of damage. Most of us, we were at the squadron that got the very first F-14Ds. It was the training squadron, because you start there and then it goes to the fleet. Well, we started getting all these brand new aircraft from Grumman, and they smell brand new. They look and feel so clean and everything. And I remember thinking, everybody's kind of like, man, we're a little bit worried about who's going to scratch the first one, or who's going to crash the first one, because they're so expensive. And sure enough, it was a good year later, and one of my buddies took off, and for some reason had a late abort, but he had already raised the landing gear. And he thought he was still on deck, so he kind of raised it and lowered it, but it came up just enough to where the nose gear was starting to come up. So bottom line is, this thing, the aircraft didn't get airborne, but it's going down the runway with the kind of collapsed gear, and it just chews the nose. And the F-14 had the chin pod, yes, and the F-14D had a dual chin pod. It had a TCS television camera on one side, and about the same diameter was the IRST, the infrared. And that was a really expensive sensor, both there. And that chin pod was just chewed off. So, the plane obviously flew again. Well, I was on the flight schedule that 2 weeks later when it was ready to go flying, but they had not repaired the chin pod yet. They had to basically take what was remaining of it off. So now this thing looked like an old Tomcat from the 70s, when they were super. And that chin pod actually creates quite a bit of drag for the aircraft. And so we were airborne doing the post-maintenance check flight, and there's a part where we do a high-speed dash just to make sure it can go, and usually go 1.2, 1.3 or whatever. But on this particular day, we had no chin pod, and you could just tell that the plane wanted to go faster, because it had no chin pod. And so we just kept it in the burner, and next, we're at 2.21, 2.2. And then you're starting to run out of, space because you can't go into, south of Mexico. And so we basically turned around, but we ended up going, like I said, 2.2 in that airplane. And it probably would have gone faster, At some point, you get a little worried because, if something goes wrong, you're probably not going to survive. You definitely won't survive projection. But back to your original question, as far as the dog or a DACT, I always found that if you could magically have the exact same pilot with the same skills in a Tomcat versus an F-15, and they each flew their aircraft to its properly, because every aircraft has its advantage in a certain area, I think you would find that Tomcat probably wouldn't have won that many ACM engagements, because it wasn't designed as a dogfighter per se. It turned out to be a fairly good dogfighter, especially in the hands of somebody who knew what they were doing. But
yes.
it was limited to 6.5 Gs. Well, how do you compete with an F-16 that can pull 9? So whoever pulls more Gs is going to have a tighter circle, and when you have a tight circle, you're going to be able to get back there. So I wouldn't say we always lost against our F-15s or F-18s, but it was not quite as good a dogfighter because it just wasn't designed for that. So we always. Not that we didn't enjoy, especially in similar aircraft, 1v1s. It's always, because that is truly now a test of aircrew versus aircrew, not aircraft. But it's a fine dogfighter. But in reality, it would be very difficult to compete with an F-15 that could pull more Gs, an F-16 that could definitely pull almost 50% more Gs. They had ACM. Weaponry that ours was again designed and that never really changed. You have these ACM modes now, and today we've got the joint helmet technology where now you just basically move your head and you could designate and point, and that changes so much, because now your aircraft doesn't necessarily need to be able to maneuver fast, because in the old days you had to get your nose on your enemy to be able to shoot them, or at least close. Right nowadays you could just use your head point and designate. It creates a lot of other interesting predicaments. But it was the other disadvantage of the Tomcat in terms of dogfighting was it was the easiest one to be seen, because it was such a big aircraft. You could see Tomcats 12, 14 miles away. Now they're going to be little dots, but you could see them that far. Whereas an F5 or an A4, you won't see those until you're 4 miles. I mean, so. Everybody likes to say, the Tomcat was the Top Gun aircraft, blah, blah. It was the primary go-to jet fighter just because, it was our only fighter in the early 70s or into the 80s until the Hornet came along. But the bottom line is it was designed as an interceptor, and it did a fantastic job as an interceptor, and it did a fine job as an ACM machine. But in reality, again, how many tight combat in the history in the last 30 years, how many of those have we seen? Not a lot. So you can argue, it's fun to train, and you should always train for guns only and all that stuff. But in reality, it's not that practical. And when I was on the Top Gun staff, they used to say of the current aircraft that in a fight at range you want to be in an F-15 pre-merge. When you're at the merge, you want to be in the F-18 because it was probably the best of the maneuvering. And then when it's time to leave and run, you want to be in the Tomcat because that was the fastest one and you can get away. And that was a great way to engage, was to know when not to fight, and you can outrun most of your enemy. And so a lot of ours would be slashing attacks where you come in forward, try to kill as many as you can, And if a guy doesn't see you, by all means, you roll in and try to take him out. But if it becomes this, a skirmish, if you can leave rather than get shot, it's probably better to do that. So